Hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle. Welcome to PJTV. And ever since the dawn of the progressive era at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, liberal revisionists have tried to convince us that entrepreneurs and anyone who's become wealthy is just naturally a bad person. Our culture often portrays the wealthy as people who've gotten rich off of someone else's labor, but that's not usually the case, and we can learn this from many examples in history. I recently read Burt Folsom's book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, which corrects the narrative of some of our nation's earliest tycoons. Dr. Folsom is a professor of history at Hillsdale College, and he joins us now from that location. Thanks for joining us again, Dr. Folsom. We had a great time talking to you last time. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you, Bill. I'm glad to be back.
I have to tell you, Burt, honestly, I read your book, Myth of the Robber Barons, right after we did that last interview, and I read it. I just read it through. I read it through. One of the most influential books I've ever read. I really mean that. It fundamentally rewired my head and gave me a new vocabulary in terms of understanding what happened not only in the business days back of the days of the so-called robber barons, but what's actually happening today. So I'd like to start by asking you to explain two terms that are just remarkably clear to me, just really changed the way I look at things. And those two terms are a political entrepreneur versus a market entrepreneur. Can you tell us what you meant by those two categories of robber baron?
Absolutely. Market entrepreneurs are those people who are trying to succeed, those businessmen, by competing in the marketplace and selling a product at a competitive price. Political entrepreneurs try to succeed by using a government subsidy, some kind of government regulation or handout to enhance their ability to compete effectively. So that we have political entrepreneurs using the political marketplace, and you have market entrepreneurs trying to produce quality products at competitive prices to please consumers.
Well said. And your book has a number of examples, and I want to, actually there's so many examples, I don't think we can pack it into one interview, so we're going to actually do this in two parts, but the examples are so shockingly clear, and they translate so well into the modern era. So let's take a look at this difference between what we would call free market capitalism versus a term that's often used, either crony capitalism or mercantilism. Let's start with the first example in your book, and I'll just tee it up real quick for you. James Fulton invented the steamboat, and basically Robert Fulton invented the steamboat, and he basically went to the government and said, hey, I've built this remarkable vehicle. I want exclusive license to carry passengers up and down in the New York waterways. And he was granted that.
Yes.
And the price was set at a certain price. And along comes Cornelius Vanderbilt, who basically says, I'm going to outcompete this guy. And he kept lowering the rates and lowering the rates and lowering the rates. It's just shocking. I think you said in the book there was a point where he wasn't even charging anything. Basically, he was just charging for food and drinks or something. Can you tell us how he was able to outcompete this monopoly that Fulton had established?
Right. Now, this is a state-based monopoly. There are two kinds of monopolies. This one was one given by the state of New York. The worst kind are the federal monopolies, because then you have control over the whole marketplace in the United States. But this was just the state of New York, which gave a monopoly to Robert Fulton if he could successfully operate a steamboat. And he did so. He was charging very high prices also. But you had Cornelius Vanderbilt and, in fact, his friend Thomas Gibbons, who were operating a steamboat from New Jersey to New York. And their prices were so competitive that ultimately the monopoly, the Fulton monopoly, could not compete with the rates that Vanderbilt was doing his steamship business for.
And Vanderbilt then took the same model to the transatlantic trade, right? Because as the transatlantic trade started to open up, end of the 1800s, both the British and the Americans, in response, subsidized those routes very heavily with, was it Cunard, I guess, who had the subsidized routes. And once again, Vanderbilt gets in there and says, no, we're going to carry mail for almost less than it costs, because we understand that if we can build this volume of trade by lowering prices, we'll do better, and the consumer will do better.
Absolutely, and in this case, there were federal subsidies, and the British, as you just mentioned, with the Cunard Company, was giving subsidies as well over in England. So you had the United States giving subsidies to Edward Collins, you had the British giving subsidies to Cunard, and here you have Vanderbilt coming along delivering passengers and mail from New York to Liverpool, England, and back, and doing it for much less than the companies were doing that received federal money. Those companies that received federal money, and I'm speaking of Edward Collins in particular, had no incentives to improve. They had no incentives to innovate. They just tried to preserve the subsidy and gain a profit at the expense of the government and the taxpayers. Vanderbilt, by contrast, felt a strong incentive to run a better business, produce a better product at a price that would be underneath that charged by the monopoly and the subsidized company. Therefore, Vanderbilt ended up succeeding. The subsidized companies ended up failing.
One of the things that's most remarkable about the example, and it really stood out for me in the transatlantic steamship case with Cornelius Vanderbilt, was not only was he providing much better service at a much lower price, but he was also doing it much more safely because he was innovating. He was the first to use iron hulls. He was the first to use a water screw instead of paddle wheels. He had double-hulled ships, and you say in the book that he just didn't carry insurance. That was one of the costs he saves. He just had a better captain. He had a safer vessel, and the subsidized boats are out there sinking hither and yon. What do they care, right? If the passengers all drown, they get their money from the government.
Killing passengers.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you talk about the innovation?
And we had in one of Collins's ships, over 400 passengers died. Vanderbilt never had a ship sink. He never lost a passenger. He went back and forth for many years in the 1840s, 50s, and even beyond that. Never had a ship sink. He innovated, for example, with the iron-hulled ships when he had a route that went through Nicaragua. And he was doing the Panama route as well. So when he was doing trade with China and bringing people also through the Panama area into California, he innovated with iron-hulled ships. You mentioned with the screw propellers, we had innovations. None of these were done by Edward Collins, who was receiving federal subsidies from the United States.
So in the case of Vanderbilt, before we move on, it's probably a fair statement to say that if we had just had the government subsidies with Fulton and Collins, we would not have opened up any of the Asiatic markets that Vanderbilt opened up because he was competing for the business through the Panama Canal, as you say. And we would have had slower service, and it would have cost a lot more money, and it would have been a lot more unsafe. And the people that owned those subsidies would have been rich, but the general population would have been infinitely worse off.
You're absolutely right. In the case of Panama, this was before the canal, they had to have a railroad through that 60-mile stretch of Panama. Vanderbilt was using that railroad, and at one point, as I mentioned in the book, he was using a route through Nicaragua. He was experimenting with different routes, which one would provide the best service to the customers at the most competitive price. Vanderbilt was interested. He was a market entrepreneur, interested in making a profit by giving customers a good deal. The subsidized lines simply wanted to milk the taxpayers for as much as they could. Vanderbilt easily outcompeted the lines that were receiving federal subsidies.
Well, that's the first example in your book, the remarkable book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, and you think, wow, that's a compelling case. Maybe it's just a one-off, but it's not. They just keep on coming. So let's talk about the next example, which is a little more land-based here in the United States, and that's the story of James J. Hill and his railroad. Because back when the idea of a transcontinental railroad was being actively floated, the prevailing wisdom, the conventional wisdom, was that only the government can do this. So the government subsidized two railroad lines, right? They were going to meet kind of in the middle there.
Right.
And as you outline in your book, the federal government was giving away huge parcels of land as incentive as well. And so what that meant was that the subsidized railroads were basically not picking the best route. They weren't finding the most efficient route through the country. They were just getting there as fast as they could to just gobble up the land. And along comes James J. Hill and does it completely differently. Can you tell us about that story?
Yes, James J. Hill was the equivalent of Vanderbilt. He built a railroad across the country, the Great Northern Railroad, with no federal subsidies. He did it from St. Paul to Seattle. Now, what's remarkable about that is that you had, as you mentioned, in the 1860s, the first transcontinentals, the ones that were done before Hill, that received nothing but federal money. They were paid federal money to go from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. The Central Pacific went from west to east. The Union Pacific went from east to west, and they were going to meet in Utah. Now, they soaked up $60 million of federal money. To put that in perspective, the entire U.S. national debt in 1860 was about $60 million. They spent the equivalent of the entire U.S. national debt building those railroads. They were not safe railroads. They had accidents, but beyond that, they were not efficient. They were winding railroads. They didn't gain money for the customers at all. James J. Hill's route to the north, which he built with no federal aid, was so efficient that he was virtually running the Union Pacific and Central Pacific out of business.
That's pretty much it. He took his time. It was his own money. He was the first to use these new steel rails. Since it wasn't a question of who got there first to get the land grabs from the government, his surveyors took a lot more time. They found a straighter route with lower grades, and once that infrastructure was in place, he's moving freight at a rate that these subsidized lines could never compete with.
Yes, you're absolutely right. He managed to build that road slowly. It was a railroad slowly. He built it with high-quality rails. He did the best he could. That route, it was flat, too. He went through the Rocky Mountains and found a grade that was very, very flat through the Rocky Mountains. The end result was he had a route that was short. He had a route that was relatively flat. It was high-quality rails. It may have been the best railroad line we had in the United States. He totally defeated in competition the Northern Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific, all of which had federal funds.
And I think before we close this part one of our interview, I'd like to come back to one thing that's striking about these two men and all of the men you outline in that book. And that is that you constantly hear from these guys who've been portrayed as just the most selfish, venal, craven money grabbers. The one thing that you hear again and again and again out of their own mouths is they're concerned for the common man. They're concerned to lower the prices so that the average person can take this trip across the Atlantic or take this trip up the river or take the trip or ship his farm goods at a reasonable price so he can keep more of his profit. Isn't that really the most remarkable slander against these guys, is that they were these self-centered, greedy, grabbing men, when actually their entire motive was to make money by making things more accessible for the common man, for the poor guy?
These entrepreneurs wanted to deliver a quality product to consumers. That's how they wanted to make money, by selling something of value to millions of people. Henry Ford, by the way, followed up on this. His idea was a car in every garage. And if he can make $1 out of a car in every garage for millions of people, he becomes a millionaire and he adds value to the lives of the customers. This was exactly the thinking that Vanderbilt and Hill and many of our entrepreneurs had. And it's why the United States went from being a second-rate country at the time of the Civil War to a first-rate industrial power 50 years later.
Remarkable. We're going to hear more about some of these players in Dr. Folsom's book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, in part 2 of this interview, and we'll take a very quick look at how some of these dynamics are still at work today in the present day. So you can look for the second part coming up soon on PJTV. Thanks for joining us for part 1, Dr. Folsom. It's great to have you. We'll see you in the second part. You can find more information on Burt Folsom's work at burtfolsom.com. I'm Bill Whittle for PJTV. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.